Let us just bow our heads in a word of prayer. Just spend a few moments pondering on those words that have just been read. To consider our own Gethsemane, a place of loneliness, of desolation. Perhaps you come here this evening feeling that same abandonment, forsakenness, and loneliness. Declare that to the Lord in these few moments. Bring your cry to Him, for He hears you, even as the Father heard Jesus on his knees in that garden. Lord, we confess our need of you, even as you confessed your need of your Father in the Garden of Gethsemane. We come to you, Lord, and are ashamed of our slowness to pray, to wait on you, as the disciples did so long ago. We too fall asleep and are not vigilant and in prayer for the many needs around us. And so, Lord, just open our hearts again this evening, ponder on that anguish of yours in that garden. And may we bring our own loneliness and desolation to you, the one who knows full well what it felt like to be left alone. So we just pray that you speak through these songs and through your word tonight. In your name we pray. The reading is taken from Matthew chapter 26. We are reading from verse 36. Then Jesus went with his disciples to Gethsemane, and he said to them, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took Peter and the two sons of Zebedee along with him, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." Going a little further, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. "Could you men keep watch with me for 1 hour?" he asked Peter. "Watch and pray, so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." He went away a second time and prayed, "My Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done." When he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. So he left them and went away once more and prayed the third time, saying the same thing. And then he returned to the disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour has come, and the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." May God bless his word to us. Consider this picture. In 1959, a pastor from Kentucky, fresh from his visit to the Holy Land, had a great vision. He would establish a garden, a quiet, tranquil place of prayer, with a small chapel in his hometown of Covington. This garden would capture the Holy Land and bring it back to those who would never get the opportunity to go and see it themselves. And so he called for monetary contributions from far and wide and purchased a large tract of land. Flowers and trees were gathered from some 24 different countries and planted. A small carpenter's shop, a replica of the one that he envisaged Jesus would have had in those years of growing up in Nazareth, was built, and carpentry tools were specially flown in from Nazareth. No effort was too great to establish this magnificent garden. A replica of the open tomb added to the setting. Overlooking the entire scene stood a statue of Christ, which could be seen for miles around. And so the spring of 1959, after nearly 2 years, the pastor finally opened his beautiful dream garden to the public. He called it the Garden of Hope. At first there was great publicity and interest in the garden. People came from all over the country to see what they had heard so much about. It became a topic of conversation in the foyers of churches across the state. Not too long afterwards, however, the funds started to dry up, and the garden became a great source of heartache for all those who had poured so much of their time and resources into it. Volunteers stopped giving of their time. The visitors to the garden dwindled. The tropical plants and trees started to wither and die. The climate and environment just not suitable enough for them to thrive. And it became harder and harder for the garden to be maintained. And after just 2 years, it was closed down. From the Garden of Hope, it became a garden of desolation. Weeds took over. The chapel was vandalized. The statue of Jesus, weathered and broken, stood desolate and alone, looking out on a mournful scene. Consider the second picture, one that comes from a scene all too familiar to us on the outskirts of Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. It is the midnight hour on the eve of the first Good Friday. The paschal moon filters through the olive trees, sends shadows across the path of the little band of pilgrims that pass through the fountain gate of Jerusalem into the Kidron Valley. They pass thousands of other pilgrims who lie on the sides of the road, having indulged too much in the night's festivities, having just shared in the Passover meal. They have little regard for the anguish that is in the hearts of this band of disciples who pass them by. They arrive in the garden called Gethsemane, normally a place to picnic, a place where the happy sound of children would be heard playing hide and go seek, a place to get close to nature, a place of harmony, a place of tranquility. A short while after arriving, the leader of this band of disciples draws aside to pray. He beckons his disciples to join him. But they are tired from all the day's activities and soon fall asleep. He makes one last appeal, please stay awake with me. But they do not stir. It's been a long day, full of mixed emotions and uncertain expectations. And so Jesus begins his final onslaught alone. Not an onslaught against flesh and blood. This was not just the start of a battle between the Jews and a zealous man who claimed to be God. It was the battle between God himself and the deceiver of the universe, Satan. It was the hour for which Jesus had waited his whole life. For far away inside the city walls, it is Satan who has seized the heart of a man whose feet he had washed but hours before. A word is whispered in the ear of Caiaphas. Jesus prays passionately, so much so that his sweat turns to crimson upon his brow. A storm engulfs his soul. His initial encounter had been in the wilderness, where he had been tempted by the same adversary 3 times. But now this was the final countdown, the final encounter. He knows that before the glory of Sunday must come the agony of Friday. Before victory, the apparent defeat. Before the throne must come the cup. And he groans in anguish. He twists in torment of his pending suffering. And he kneels there. He does not smell the roses. He only smells the sweat-drenched smell of his garments. He does not feel the grass beneath, but feels the thorns, the same thorns that would be pressed into his brow with a crown upon his head. He begins the solitary ordeal that would see his disciples abandon him, would see the face of his betrayer, see his captives take hold of him, and feel the wrench of the nails in his hands and feet as the cross is lifted up. He turns again and looks at his disciples, quietly wishing they would wake up and share his cup of suffering. He kneels, silhouetted against the dark night sky, desolate divinity. His eyes remain on them as they lie still. No thought of condemnation or even accusation. He simply prays. He prays for them, and he prays for you. He cries out, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." His usual calmness deserts him as he repeats the same prayer over and over again. "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." What is this cup for which he pleads with his Father to remove? He knows what it is. For even as he kneels, he is given a preview of his passion to come, frame by frame, The sufferings he must endure flash through his mind. The crucifixion, stark and terrifying, looms before him. And all the while his humanity recoils from all that his divinity can see. And for Jesus, this garden of hope becomes his garden of desolation. This garden of beauty becomes a garden of barrenness. For even as he prays, he hears his Father's response. My son, it is not possible. And suddenly in that moment, he realizes his mission has reached its climax. He knows that he is the only one who can do what has to be done. He alone can break open heaven's gates. He alone, as the spotless Lamb of God, can offer up his life for the sin of the world. If only he could walk away. If only he could turn his back on it all. But he can't. For even as he kneels there, contemplating the agony of the cross, he sees you and me being born into a world without ever asking to be. He sees our garden of desolation. He sees our dismay as we are let down by those who call themselves our friends. He sees our despair as we are betrayed by the ones we love. He sees our loneliness as we feel the world upon our shoulders and wonder if God is really there at all. And as he thought about you and me, he dreamed of that future glory with his Father. And at the same time he dreamed of you and me being there beside him. We sometimes believe that the battle in the heavenlies was won on the cross. It wasn't. We tend to believe that the battle of the heavenlies was won when the stone was rolled away. It wasn't. The battle of the heavenlies was won here, in this garden of desolation. For it was here that Jesus made a decision to be rejected so that you and I might be accepted. And it is that decision, friends, that transforms that garden of desolation back into a garden of hope.